Welcome, everyone, to our conversation on our specific immune response. And as you see on this title slide, we also refer to this part of our immunity as adaptive immunity. And both of these names, specific or adaptive, all tie into some of the features of this portion of our immune response. So, real quick, if you will think back to what we've been talking about, we've been discussing what happens when a pathogen is kind of trying to get into our body and what happens when it actually does. So remember, we think about all the ways we try to prevent infection as our immune response, and we can divide that into two categories: our non-specific immunity, which is made up of our first and second lines of defense, and then we also have our specific immunity, which is the final and third line of defense. And so our first line of defense are things like our skin, mucous membranes, ciliary escalators, things like coughing, sneezing, ways of kind of flushing out our body. It also includes things like sweat, lactotransferins, which bind iron, all sorts of basically structural, chemical, and mechanical processes that are designed to keep pathogens out of our body. We even include our normal microbiota into our first line of defense because even though they're a part of our body, normally inside the body, they don't want pathogens to take over. So they have different mechanisms of trying to keep foreign invaders out as well. But as we know, sometimes pathogens do get in our body. They make it past that first line of defense. That's where our second line of defense came in. And those were different cells and processes meant to try to quickly detect and eliminate those pathogens. That was things like phagocytosis and natural killer cells, inflammation, right? There were 8 different ones. And they were non-specific because it didn't matter what pathogen got in, the response was the same, okay? But that second line of defense doesn't always catch the pathogen, doesn't always clear it. So we kind of have to call in the big guns to come and help out. And that is going to be our third line of defense, or our specific immunity. And so with this, we refer to it as our specific immunity because the cells involved are going to be looking for and targeting a very specific pathogen, okay? Because how we respond to E. coli is going to be different to how we respond to Salmonella versus how we respond to Ebola, okay? So that's why this is called a specific response, because at this point, our immune system is like, uh-oh, E. coli got in, that's what we're looking for, that's what we got to eliminate. So it's a much more specific response, okay? We refer to this also as our adaptive immunity because we are not born with this third line of defense, okay? We acquire it over time, okay? And so basically our immune system adapts to different pathogens as we are exposed to them, okay? So initially, we're not born with antibodies against E. coli, but when we first encounter E. coli, our immune system builds antibodies against E. coli, and then they will forever have them, okay? And so this is where there are some really big key differences between our non-specific immunity and specific immunity. Okay, and that's what you see here listed out towards the bottom. So I've already mentioned that our specific immune response is specific to the target. It is acquired over time. So again, as we're exposed to things, we build immunity towards it. So if you haven't come into contact with Salmonella before, you may not have immunity against it, whereas I might, because perhaps I have encountered it. Okay, so as you're exposed to things, you're gradually building up your immune response. We do say that our specific immunity is a delayed response. It's our third line of defense. So that means it comes into play later than our first and second lines of immunity. We don't want to call in the big dogs if the non-specific responses can handle it. Okay, and then what's really special about our specific immunity is that it does have a memory component. Okay, you're going to learn about the key players of our specific immunity, and those are B cells and T cells, and both of them can differentiate into memory cells, which means those cells stick around even after infection and are constantly on the prowl. They're just going to constantly circulate looking for that pathogen to strike again, so that when it does, we don't have to start from scratch and build all these antibodies every single time. Okay, so this is why we're not constantly sick, because as we encounter E. coli over and over again, or whichever pathogen, our body's like, oh, yep, I remember you, boom, antibodies. Okay, because the first time we experience something, the body's like, ooh, hey, what are you? I got it. Let's figure you out. I got to make some antibodies. So that initial response is a little bit longer than any, second, third, fourth, 100th time you're exposed to that same pathogen. So that first time that we're exposed to a pathogen, we refer to that as our primary immune response, right? Primary means first. So when our body detects something foreign, which is called the antigen, okay? When an antigen is detected, the body's like, ruh-roh, what is this? And our immune cells are going to detect it and they're going to respond, okay? Now, depending on the type of immune cell we're talking about, the response is going to be a little bit different. But basically, the end result is going to be to clear that infection. So it turns out we can divide our specific immunity, this third line of defense, into two branches or two arms, the humoral response and the cellular response. As you can see, the humoral response is going to be where antibodies are made. And antibodies are a crucial component of our specific immune response. The other component of it is our cellular response, which is where we're going to have certain T cells that act a lot like natural killer cells in that they're kind of going to target infected cells for apoptosis, for destruction. Okay, so we're going to have two different branches that we're going to be talking about, but there's going to be overlap. Just like we saw overlap with our non-specific immune responses, right? Phagocytosis is its own process, but it also came into play with inflammation. Opsonization helped enhance phagocytosis. So when we're learning about the immune response, yes, it's presented as all these different steps and different processes, but they all work together because at the end of the day, right, you can think of an infection as like our body and the pathogen are in a battle. They're at war. And if you've watched any, war type of movie, they don't only have cannons. They don't only have, a big wall around the castle. They have the big wall, which is kind of like the structural component, like our first line of defense. They have those little catapults, right, where they like light things on fire and they spray them. They have the archers, not archers, the bow and arrow people. Yeah, archer. Whatever, you get what I'm saying. Then you have people with weapons, right? You have all sorts of different approaches to defeating that same enemy. And that's what our immune response is. We have lots of different things happening, but the same overall goal, okay? So key to this third line of defense, which we also saw as an important role with our second line of defense, is this idea of differentiating self from non-self. In other words, which cells belong to us and should be present, those are the self cells, and which cells do not belong. They are foreign. That's what we call non-self cells. So back with our discussion on our second line of defense, we introduced MHC1, which are little surface molecules found on all nucleated cells in the body. Okay, so remember, we are eukaryotic. Okay, the majority of our cells have a nucleus. And so, especially when we're thinking about viral or bacterial pathogens, right, they don't have a nucleus. So this is really helpful. So MHC1 is found on all of our human nucleated cells. Okay, and so this is how natural killer cells and certain types of T cells are going to be able to say these cells do belong because they have MHC1, so they must be host human cells. Or, ooh, you do not have MHC1, so you should not be here. Either you are a pathogen and you don't belong, or you might be an infected host cell, and we need to get rid of you to limit the spread of the infection. Because remember, an infected self cell, maybe that cell of ours has been infected by a virus, it's not going to have as many MHC1s on its surface, okay? And so it's going to be the presence or absence of MHC1 and then how many it has if it is a self cell. Now, what's new to the conversation are MHC2 molecules, and these are found on a subset of self cells, and we refer to these as antigen presenting cells, or APCs. And antigen presenting cells do exactly what their name implies. They find an antigen, which is the foreign part of a pathogen, and they present it to the rest of the immune cell. I always think of this as like the head on a spike. If you've watched like Game of Thrones or Reign, or again, any kind of medieval show, right? When they find an intruder or somebody that they consider like betrayal, right? They cut off their head and they put it on a stick and they present it to the rest of the town, right? And they're like, look what happened here, right? And so that's what these antigen presenting cells are doing. They find the pathogen, they're going to phagocytose it, right? Chop it to bits. And then they take the antigen, the part of that pathogen that the body recognized as foreign, and they present it to the rest of the immune response. And essentially they're saying, hey, B cells, T cells, immune response in general, look what I have here. There is a pathogen in the body. We need to hunt it down and we need to eliminate it. This is what you are looking for, okay? And so these antigen presenting cells are going to play a key role in activating that humoral response and cellular response. Remember, those are the two arms of our specific immunity, okay? So as you can see in this picture over here, if some of these immune cells find that MHC1, they say, yay, you belong. But if they find an antigen instead of MHC1, for instance, notice our immune cell is unhappy and it's going to target it for destruction, okay? So remember, y'all, key takeaway at this exact moment in time, antigen is something the body recognizes as foreign, okay? Notice this entire bacteria, for instance, or it could be a virus, honestly, it doesn't matter. Based on the shape, we're going to go with bacteria. Notice it's not recognizing the entire thing as foreign. It's a specific part of the pathogen that the body's like, ooh, hey, these little triangular molecules, they should not be here, okay? And so this is what we're going to be talking a lot about, okay? In this case, the pathogen does not have MHC1. Instead, it has an antigen. So whenever you hear the word antigen, you need to think pathogen, okay? All right, we're going to round up this conversation. Sorry, I had kind of gotten ahead of myself with the antigen presenting cell conversation, but I did want to show you a picture for this process. Okay, so remember, antigen presenting cells are going to be cells that find and catch the pathogen. They're going to phagocytose it and present it to the rest of the immune response. Okay, so here you see this big old cell. That is the antigen presenting cell. Here's the pathogen. Okay, so notice it's undergoing phagocytosis, right? Right here it's being endocytosed. Here is the phagosome, which contains the pathogen. Notice the little lysosomes are coming. So now we have that phagolysosome. It chops it to bits, okay? But notice the circle, that's considered the antigen here. This little red circle is going to be presented right here, okay? And so it's being presented outwards. So now the rest of the immune response can detect it. And it's like, uh-oh, You're right. That is an antigen. That should not be here. We need to find more of these bacteria and make sure we get them all so that the host, us, doesn't get too sick. Okay? So again, self versus non-self is going to be important. And antigen presenting cells play a role in differentiating that. And when it comes into contact with something that doesn't belong, like the bacteria in this picture, they're going to eliminate what they find, but then they're going to present that antigen to the rest of the body so that all the other immune components can be on the lookout for it. All right, y'all. This is going to be a fun conversation. This wraps up this video. Please let me know if you have any questions.